All right. Well, thank you for the introduction, Christy. As you said, my name is Liz, and I decided to do this as a presentation because you had mentioned that we were having this as the topic of the volunteer weekend in July. And so I thought it would be a good idea to kind of give an overview and maybe get people excited for the weekend coming up. And so this is really just meant to be an introduction, as you can see in the lower text there. I am by no means an expert, just an interested citizen, I guess. And it's definitely something that I see happening on Cayuga Lake, which is the lake that I live near. So that's kind of the way I got into this. And without further ado, harmful algal blooms. So that's what HABs are, in case you hear them referred to them that way. The CDC defines them as the rapid growth of algae or cyanobacteria that can cause harm to people, animals, or the local ecology. And I liked that definition specifically because it acknowledges that HABs are not always algae. They include cyanobacteria, and that's actually what we're going to be focusing on today. And it also talks about the various harm that it can do, not only to people. I think a lot of times we focus on the health risks to people and animals, which are, of course, important, but also mentioning the local ecology and the damage it can do there too. And we'll talk a little bit more later on about the specifics in terms of the harms. On the right, you can see a very pea soupy looking picture that I took at Stewart Park in July of 2020. This is an area that is somewhat shallow, doesn't turn over much. So it was the ripe conditions for algae blooms there, and I think they get them there somewhat frequently when they do occur. This was before I knew about the option to report these harmful algal blooms, so I don't think I reported it at the time, but I did take note and took a picture and thought that was kind of interesting / kind of gross. All right, so I already referred to the fact that harmful algal blooms are not necessarily just algae. There are many different kinds of harmful algal blooms. You can see on the right is an example of what you may have heard referred to as a red tide. They are dinoflagellates and diatoms in marine environments that often cause the blooms there. You might have heard about reduced shellfish counts and things like that, because you can get poison from eating bottom feeders that have taken in these kind of bacteria. And so you have those kinds. You have, it could be phytoplankton, benthic algae, which is algae that grows in the bottom of water environments, macroalgae, which is essentially seaweed, and then cyanobacteria, which is often called blue-green algae, even though it is technically not an algae. And this is the kind that occurs most often in freshwater environments, and it's the kind that we encounter in New York State in our lakes the most. So that's what we're actually going to be talking about tonight. But before I went forward, I just wanted to mention that there are these other kinds of harmful algal blooms. I wonder how many times I'm going to trip over that. I'll just use the HABs from now. So yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that there's a wide variety of these, all with their own unique ecologies and everything. All right, so cyanobacteria. These are amazing organisms, and I was talking to a woman who works at the Community Science Institute here locally, someone I know through a couple of different ways, and she was saying how I really need to pass on that they're not all bad. These are the bacteria that are responsible for giving us oxygen. How many 3.5 billion years ago? There's some debate over exactly when they evolved, but they're one of the earliest things to evolve, and that's for sure. They are photosynthetic bacteria. So these bacteria can convert sunlight and sugar into oxygen. And they are the ancestors of modern plants. In fact, I was reading that chloroplasts are essentially, they were involved in the development or the evolution of chloroplasts in current plant cells via something that they called endosymbiosis, which essentially is when one organism lives in another organism. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and that they're capable of sharing their DNA by sort of bumping into each other. So they reproduce and evolve really differently than animals and plants that reproduce via sexual reproduction. And the slides that I included here, or the pictures rather, are 3 kinds of cyanobacteria that are most common in Cayuga Lake specifically. So a lot of the reading and research I did was based on Cayuga Lake, since that's the one, as I mentioned, that I live near. And this just shows that there are many different forms that these bacteria come in. And what we're really going to be talking about a lot is the microcystis on the upper right hand side there, because that is the one that produces the toxin that is dangerous for human and animal health. So what do these look like around here anyway? So they come in various forms. You can have the parallel sort of green streaks you see on the upper left there. It can look like a bright green pea soup that you see down below. Can have sort of, it looks like duckweed almost, which is not cyanobacteria, but kind of has that look a little bit on the upper right, or it can look on the bottom right like that spilled paint kind of picture that I had taken in 2020. And these are all thanks to the New York State DEC website, which has a wealth of information if anyone wants to follow up with that. At the end of the presentation, I have a few different resources and websites that you can check out for further information, but they had really good pictures and explanations there. All right, so what causes them? I did find that there was some debate over whether they were sort of human caused or naturally occurring. I think in the marine environments, there's more of an argument that they might be more naturally occurring, but I think in our case with the cyanobacteria, it's pretty clearly linked to a variety of things, including warmer water temperatures. So in part due to climate change, and also these blooms happen typically, in the middle of summer, right when we want to be getting in the water, warm. So they kind of ruin that for us. They like a lot of light. Obviously, they're photosynthesizing, so they need the light. They like high nutrient levels, especially nitrogen and phosphorus. So when we talk about ways to prevent the blooms, a lot of it is by preventing these nutrients, excess nutrients, from getting into the lake. And then finally, it tends to happen in bodies of water that are calm, that have distinct layers. So there's not a lot of mixing and aeration. Just allows them to grow more profusely. This is an interesting graphic that I found from a paper that was called The Complicated and Confusing Ecology of Microcystis Blooms. And as you can see, I did indeed find it somewhat confusing, but it basically shows, if you look at the black lines that are going across there, things below the line are low levels. If it's above the line, it's a high level, and if it's right on the line, then it's kind of neutral. And it just shows that what happens is you get a lot of nutrients from runoff, for example, from poorly maintained septics, from a variety of things. You've got the nitrogen, phosphate, and silicone. And then the algae starts to bloom, it starts to eat up those nutrients. So the nutrients are temporarily lower, and this is going to be a problem for other things that rely on nutrients. So it's outcompeting things. Eventually the bloom is going to collapse, and it will be decayed, and that's the process that actually will deoxygenate the water. And so, yeah, at first I was confused about this because they provided oxygen for us, but the process of their decomposition creates a lack of oxygen in the water. And obviously that's a problem for fish and plant life that depends on it. And then as it collapses, those nutrients are temporarily released back into the water. And in the case of lakes that do turnover twice a year, you'll see that this cycle will kind of start over the next season. So the DEC has established 4 different criteria for bloom status. I thought I would just mention briefly what they are here. Everything from no bloom at all to a suspicious bloom, a confirmed bloom, and a confirmed bloom with high toxins. And this can be measured either by professionals or by trained citizens or people like you and I. It's a slightly different pattern to get down to the confirmation, but either way, it's really useful for figuring out where it is, how intense of a bloom it is, where it's going. And then blooms themselves are sort of assessed by measuring levels of chlorophyll that are in the water, and then also the level of the microcystin that are present, and that's the toxin that they're measuring the level of there. All right, so why are they harmful? As you can see, they're harmful for many reasons. First of which, ecosystem damage. So we talked about eutrophication, which is essentially overly high levels of nutrients and the creation of these low oxygen zones that things can't survive in, so dead zones. And just the algae itself will shade out vegetation that way too, even aside from the oxygen issue. So other organisms living on other layers of the lake will struggle. And then, of course, there's the toxins. So the cyanobacteria is not harmful to us in the way that a lot of bacteria is, in that it doesn't get into us and cause problems. The toxins are produced by the bacteria when they're in the lake, and it's the toxins that are the problem. And they cause liver damage. They can cause neurological damage. They can cause skin irritation. And all this is especially dangerous to pets, especially dogs, because they'll be licking their fur when they come out of the water, and then just directly ingesting the toxin. They're also much smaller size-wise too. So I think just by body weight, they're more susceptible to the toxins more quickly. And the way that we would get them in, you can either swallow the water. So if you were, kayaking or swimming and you accidentally swallow the water, they can also be aerosolized apparently. So they can be just like in the air around a body of water, which is kind of scary. So yeah, and these are really good reasons why we want to avoid bodies of water when they do have these levels of cyanobacteria. There's also economic costs associated with these harmful algal blooms. Just the cost of monitoring and also treating. I think about 100,000 people in the Cayuga Lake watershed have the lake water as either primary or a backup drinking water, which is something I did not realize before looking into this. But obviously, you can't be drinking water that has this stuff in it. So that forces people to either start buying water, or facilities to start really treating it in a more aggressive way. But either way, it's expensive to deal with. There's also the expense where you might be losing tourism dollars for your local community because of the lost opportunity for recreation, and also for your own community not being able to use your beaches. I know I've been disappointed going somewhere and thinking I could get in the water and then looking and realizing that wasn't a good idea. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons why these are not good. I mentioned watershed just now, and I thought it might be useful to give a brief definition, even though I think most of you probably know what a watershed is. The USGS defines it as an area of land that drains all the streams and rainfall to a common outlet, such as the outflow of a reservoir, mouth of a bay, or any point along a stream channel. It's also called a drainage basin. So anyone who's living sort of within this area is going to be affecting how the water gets into the lake and our watershed. So before I talk about sort of what can be done at an individual level, I was looking to what is being done at a larger organization at a state level. And I thought I would just give kind of a little brief timeline here. 2012 is the first time these were recorded in New York State, I believe. 2013, it was first confirmed bloom on Cayuga Lake here. By 2017, we had 6 beaches on this lake closed for a total of 62 days. And I think the numbers, if you were to take all the lakes in New York State that were closing, was much greater, obviously. Also in 2017, Governor Cuomo enacted a Clean Water Infrastructure Act, and this provided, it was $2.5 billion, I have to check, to really work on all different kind of measures. And then in 2018, he created a specifically 4-point initiative that directed $60 million toward creating 12 action plans for the lakes that are most affected by the HABs here. So Cayuga Lake is one of them. And I did read a little bit of the Cayuga Lake action plan, and I was really impressed with how thoughtful, and they really a lot of different things in terms of like manure management agriculturally, trying to make sure, municipal septics are working well, protecting and conserving lands. There's just a whole variety of ways that they were trying to address the issue. So I was definitely impressed that work is being done. So in terms of what we can do as citizens or on an individual level, especially for people that live close to the lake or anywhere in the watershed, is to not overly fertilize things. Don't fertilize your lawns. In fact, apparently there is a New York State nutrient runoff law that prohibits any use of fertilizer from December 1st to April 1st. And you would think, well, why would someone be fertilizing in the winter, which I guess is a fair point, but they don't want that to then sort of become part of the melt and thaw and runoff that goes into the lakes in spring. You're not allowed to use phosphorus any time of the year unless your lawn is newly seeded or you can show specific soil depletion of that element, because phosphorus and nitrogen both contribute, but some people argue that phosphorus is the most important contributing factor. Another thing that we can do is make sure that our septic systems are functioning well. There are lots of different kinds of septic systems, but here's just a basic diagram of one. And you can see that, after wastewater leaves the house, it eventually goes into the septic tank, which is where the solids are. And then the liquids will go through a drain field. And then your soil is actually doing a lot of the filtering. And that's something I think I also did not necessarily realize, is that, that's an important service that our soil is doing for us, but it's not necessarily equipped to filter out everything. For example, like phosphates and things. So in order to prevent those from getting into the groundwater and then eventually into the lakes, using phosphate-free cleaning products is really helpful. And I think more and more people are aware of trying to avoid that in our personal care products and our dishwasher, detergent, and things like that. Another thing you can do if you are living by a waterway is to create a riparian buffer or a rain garden, depending on where you are. As you can see, these can be very beautiful as well as functional. And if I read right, I think this is one of the things that is going to be happening during the weekend volunteer Master Naturalist weekend in July, so that there might be some planting of a riparian buffer. And essentially what you're doing with this is preventing runoff, getting those nutrients and water absorbed by the plants before they have a chance to get into the lake water there. And you can see there are different zones that this diagram anyway has broken it up into, all the way from your upland, your trees and shrubs, all the way to things that are actually rooted in the water. I also wanted to touch on briefly what is being done for active management of blooms when they're happening. It's difficult to control when these happen, and it's very expensive, and there are often a lot of negative consequences for the things that you might need to do. So prevention is by far the best strategy, and that was very obvious. And that's where most of the money and effort is going right now, because a lot of these other sort of methods they've come up with are either just not very practical or overly expensive. But a couple of things that have been tried are to essentially get the cyanobacteria out of the water with clay, or it's called sedimentation. And so it will drop they would sort of bind to whatever material you're spraying onto it, and then it would drop it to the bottom of the lake where it's not able to photosynthesize or live any longer. Apparently you can also do surface skimming. I don't think this would work on a very large scale, but it is something that has occasionally been done. They've also tried using ultrasound. You can use sound waves to break up these cells at a cellular level. So those are some of the mechanical things that people have tried. Biologically, you can create sort of artificial wetlands or floating islands, and these would theoretically outcompete algae for nutrients. I don't know how often this has been complete. I can't imagine really creating a floating island. It's probably better to preserve whatever wetlands we already have existing. But again, this is a thought for one way that you could combat it. You can also try introducing a species that would be a predatory species, but anytime you're introducing species, it can be kind of a dangerous game, because then you might have problems down the line that you can't foresee when you first introduce it. Chemically, there are a few options, algicides that are copper-based or hydrogen peroxide-based. But a lot of times these chemicals are going to be also killing a lot of good things. So it's not really an ideal solution. And then a fun word that I learned in the course of looking this up, flocculation, essentially finding ways to take the nutrients out of the water and dropping them down to the base so that they're not available to the algae anymore. And again, I think that's probably costly, and probably the nutrients are not going to be available for other things. So might not want to do that way. And then lastly, environmental manipulation. So you can do dredging, you can do aeration, water drawdowns, basically finding ways to manipulate the level of water and to try to mix it up and prevent it from being so still and prone to the algae growth. So getting involved, becoming a HABs carrier. This is a program that is run here at Cayuga Lake, and you basically volunteer to monitor a specific section of the shoreline once a week, I believe, and you get trained to do so. And this might also be something that Christy is going to talk about in July. I'm not entirely sure about that, but it's something that's a great program here locally and conducted in partnership with the Community Science Initiative that I had mentioned earlier. They're the ones that are doing the sampling on the lake to assess the bloom status. Of course, you can attend the Master Naturalist training in July. Sounds like a fun weekend. I hope to be there. And then I think reporting is definitely, it seems like one of the best things you can do to really help scientists keep track of what's going on and how it's spreading and how big the bloom is, and just contributing to the database of knowledge, essentially, because we're still learning a lot about what causes them. There was definitely controversy when I was looking into that. So yeah, more knowledge is always good. And then here are a variety of sources and resources. The general info from the New York State DEC was pretty helpful, giving a good overview. There's the reporting link there, and also the more local map that you can find. This was really helpful for me, the CSA map, or CSI, sorry, map. And they update it very regularly starting, I believe, at the end of June. And if you're going to go out on the lake, you can see what are the current blooms, where are they? And yeah, it's updated very frequently, often by volunteers such as ourselves. There's also the Cayuga Lake Watershed Network. They have a lot of great information. They're also of the local efforts here. And then the last is a link just from the EPA that has a lot of a good overview as well for their information. And I think I did that presentation way too fast because I was a little bit nervous, but that is essentially my overview. I would welcome any questions, or if anyone has other things to contribute, that would be great too. I apologize for being a little shorter than I realized that it would be.
I thought that was great, Liz.
Oh, good. I'm going to try to go back to not sharing my screen for a second so I can see everyone. Let's see.
I think someone has their hand up. Adrian?
Hello. Yeah, I'm just wondering, if you're, say, driving down a road, is there any way you can say, oh, that's definitely HAB, or, is there definitive?
If you're just driving?
Yeah.
I would say
get right up there and look at it.
You can report it as a suspicious bloom, especially once you get used to seeing what they look like. And once you report it as a suspicious bloom, it will go on and be confirmed by someone else. So I would say if you think it looks like one, it's worth reporting it, and someone else will look into it further.
Okay, thanks.
Joy is asking about predatory species. I'm not sure exactly what you mean, Joy, like a species that would consume the cyanobacteria. Is that what you're talking about?
Oh, I think I had mentioned as one of the control options. I came across an article, and it talked about introducing fish that would eat the plankton eating fish. And I honestly, when I think about it, I'm not entirely sure how that would help. It seems more like you'd want to introduce fish that were eating the cyanobacteria algae. But so yeah, I'm not totally sure on how that one would work in this particular context, I would say.
Yeah, that's interesting. My background, I work for CC Onondaga and do water quality education. So HABs is like huge on my radar, and I've never heard of like a predatory control really, like, or at least I don't know any of the lakes that are like pursuing that, but it's definitely interesting. So I don't know.
I was looking at everything that anyone had ever thought of or tried. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that one was even ever tried or if it was just an idea that someone had.
Yeah, there's a lot that's been done in like marine ecosystems too that I don't even know about. So yeah, let's see. Dave is asking, how do these blooms impact aquatic?
I think I lost your last part of the question.
Just like aquatic resources, so like sport fishing, commercial fishing, how can HABs impact that?
Well, definitely commercial fishing when in marine environments for sure. And in our environment, yeah, I mean, you don't want to be eating fish out of contaminated waters. I don't think there's like a law that's preventing you, but it's just, yeah, it's a really bad idea.
Yeah. Barbara is asking, do you know if this monitoring is done on lakes in other parts of New York? She's in Putnam County.
Yeah, it's pretty, there's things throughout New York State. There are 12 lakes that have individual action plans, but there are tons of local, so like water associations. And I'm sure that it would be easy to find ways to monitor on your particular body of water. And Camille, you might know more about what the resources would be, but.
Yeah, I would say if you have a lake association, most of them are doing the HABs reporting or some type of lake group. Some of them have different names. And then also for the state, like you can report it on any water body. So you could at least do that yourself. You could report it to the DEC if you wanted to. Lori is asking, Liz, how does changing water level control HABs?
So when I looked into this, and these are things you can only do really if you have a dammed water body, because otherwise you're not going to be able to like you can't just drain Cuba Lake. But I think by lowering the water, they're hoping to essentially kind of dry out a little bit of the algae and then pump water back in, from what I understood. And correct me if I'm wrong, Camille, but yeah, it didn't seem like that was going to be applicable to many areas, and questionable if it would even work in the first place, but it was something that I did come across in the research.
Yeah, from what I've heard,
we did see that in a lake up here where they control the water level on a dammed lake, and it controls weeds that live in the lake like milfoil. So it doesn't allow the weeds to grow up around the shoreline, but I'd never heard it applied to HABs. So that's interesting.
Yeah, maybe they're just thinking the same strategy might work somehow, even though they're not, attached to the bottom of the lake, or a little different that way.
Let's see. Adrian's asking, is HAB monitoring or reporting throughout New York State?
Yes. Yep. I would say the DEC is in charge of information for all of the state, and a lot of times, like with our local link where we report, that same information is then shared with the DEC. So you can do it locally, you can do it at the state level through the DEC.
Hey, Dave is asking, is the major threat of these blooms the toxicity or using up all the oxygen?
So I would say it depends on, for humans and animals, it's the toxicity. So it's the microcystin, I don't have the word in front of me. I should really know it by now. But in terms of the ecology, yeah, it can kill fish. It could be the dead zone. It can shade out. It can prevent sunlight from reaching things that are underneath. So ecologically, it's probably more the lack of oxygen. And then I would say for the health of us, the pets and animals, more of the toxins. Although I imagine the toxins might also affect some of the other species that live in the lake, but I didn't actually come across that specifically.
Yeah, and I'll say there's multiple different types of toxins. There's like some that are liver toxins, some that are only neurotoxins. Microcystin is the one that seems to be the biggest in the Finger Lakes, but depending on where you are, and if it's like, you know, marine or freshwater, that can vary the toxins too. So that's even interesting too, to figure out which cyanobacteria and stuff you have happening in your water body.
I was reading too that they're thinking that some of the ways that the toxin is released is actually when the cell dies. So when it's lysed, it gives off more of these toxins. So when you think about trying to kill them off, you're also realizing that might create this giant toxin dispersal.
Yeah, absolutely. And so like Skinny Atlas Lake is the drinking water source for Syracuse, and they were trying to get permits to use basically like a copper algicide for it. And a lot of folks were concerned that if they were killing off the HABs, if it was going to cause more problems by releasing all these toxins. And so they went through a very lengthy public approval process and public comment process. I don't know if Cayuga Lake has tried to do anything similar for their HABs problem, or how are they managing it, I guess? I don't know.
That's a good question. I know that they do put something, I've definitely seen the signs that they're treating the lake with something, but I'm not sure if it's for that or if it's one of the other invasive plant species that's there. So I did not find that, but the Cayuga action plan or whatever is really cool and good. So I didn't have time to look through the whole thing, but I'm sure that they detail what's been done or what they're going to try to do.
Let's see. I don't see any other questions. I don't know. Are there any questions that folks have that they want to ask, not through the chat? Any comments anyone wants to share? Do any of you live next to lakes and struggle with HABs?
Or if anyone has other information that they want to chime in, I really appreciate you being able to offer that, Camille.
Yeah, no problem. I was like, ooh, HABs, like part of my day to day.
Christy, I missed the beginning. Did you talk about the July weekend?
She did briefly. She mentioned just the dates and that it would kind of be in Cayuga Lake and that it would focus on HABs, but not any specifics. I think she said that's coming soon. So stay tuned.
Thanks. Thanks, Liz. That was nice.
Oh, great. Yeah. Thank you guys all for joining and yeah, putting up with my little bit of nervousness there, but I appreciate the supportive audience, and hopefully I'll get to see some of you at the July weekend.
Yeah, you did great, Liz. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's been fun learning about it and also a little scary, but.
All right. Well, have a great night, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thanks, Liz.
Bye.
Okay, whenever you're ready.